Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 166. Frederick Ogle. Frederick Ogle featured in both Sydney and Melbourne court cases from 1887 on conspiracy charges, swindling and contempt of court. Frederick was born in 1848 in Belfast, Antrim, Ireland. He was a twin. His brother Isaac was the firstborn, and he also had convictions in Australia. Frederick's parents were Frederick Ogle Sr., a wine merchant, and Sarah Hardy, and he was one of 8 children. 2 of his brothers came out to Australia, one mentioned as Isaac and the other one Francis. On his Victorian jail record, he's described as 5'11.5" tall, with a fresh complexion, grey hair, blue eyes, a long nose, grey eyebrows, born in 1846 in Ireland, and his trade was listed as a speculator. However, his New South Wales record states he's born in 1848 in Ireland, so he's put himself 2 years younger, and that he arrived on the ship the Garonne, and his occupation was listed as a commercial agent. His description in that jail record was sandy hair with blue eyes and 6 foot high. Frederick married Adelaide Louisa Lemurse on the 16th of January 1879 at St Martin in the Fields, London, when he was 31 and Adelaide 26. Adelaide was the daughter of Petrie Nurse, or Lemurse, interchanging surnames with him, and Elizabeth Ann Dixon. Adelaide's father was a shipbroker. She was born in Leeds in 1853, and Adelaide was their only child. Her mother had died in 1868 when she was only 15, and Petrie died aged only 45 when Adelaide was 19. The shipping records state what Frederick wrote in his New South Wales jail record, which was that they came out on the Garonne in 1882. Frederick and Adelaide had 7 children, with 5 surviving infancy. It's interesting as Frederick takes on his wife's maiden name within 3 years of coming to Australia. So on the 24th of February 1885, it says, a meeting of stewards of the Tasmanian Racing Club, it was decided to disqualify Frederick Lemurse from entering upon the Elwick course for all time. And then on the 28th of February 1885, it says, conspiracy to defraud in Launceston. At the Glenorchy Police Court yesterday, Henry Rogers and Frederick Lemurse, who were arrested in Launceston on Thursday evening on a charge arising out of alleged tampering with the racehorse Titchburn in the ladies' bracelet at the Hobart Races, were brought upon a charge of having unlawfully combined on the 11th with another person unknown to obtain from Henry Commode a sum of £40. The local superintendent of police applied for a remand, which was objected, but after argument the bench granted a remand until Monday, with bail being allowed and found. This case is exciting considerable interest in the sporting circles. And then on the 3rd of March 1885, the Tasmanian conspiracy case. The Glenorchy Police Court Tasmania was crowded on Monday morning, it being expected that the case against Henry W. Rogers and Frederick Lemurse, charged with conspiring to defraud Henry Commode in connection with the running of Titchburn at the last race meeting, would be proceeded with. The defendants being called upon answered to their names when the Superintendent of Police informed the bench that the charges were withdrawn. It is rumoured that Rogers and Lemurse intend to bring actions for damages against the stewards of the Tasmanian Racing Club and against the superintendent to recover damages for wrongful imprisonment. There was a recollection on the 22nd of February 1911 that was published in the Sydney Mail and New South Wales Advertiser, a story of the past. I read with regret the other day of the death of a very old acquaintance, Mr. Harry Rogers, a restless rolling stone who tasted life in the rough from one end of Australia to the other. Mr. Rogers was a daredevil rider over fences and in the bush. I first met him out Birkway in the 1880s. He was a little better than a youth then and was in from one of the Warrego stations with an alleged jumper engaged in the Burke steeplechase, which was then about the biggest cross-country event in the state outside Sydney. Many of us thought he was a bit mad, but out of the saddle he was a particularly sane and a most genial companion. He mixed with the best company and was popular with all classes, but about a year later in 1885 he fell from grace During one of his trips down south, he fell in with a plausible, swell-looking Englishman at Scott's in Melbourne. A friendship was quickly established between the hail-fellow well-met boy and the distinguished gentleman, a tall, straight-backed fair man who was always studiously well-groomed. He wore a top hat, a monocle and a long Piccadilly moustache. Rogers thought he was a gentleman. He was known as Le Merce, but his real name was Ogle, and I've heard that he originally hailed from the East End at Shoreditch, or some equally salubrious suburb of London. However, he quit, left the mark of his native environment behind him when he joined a London swell mob and became a pastmaster in the art of easing the gilded youth in the West End of their spare cash. Nothing happened that influenced him to leave the city of the world, which he loved so well, and take up his residence in Melbourne. He left without the knowledge of the police, otherwise the Victorian Detective Department would have known of his antecedents when he became a citizen of the Yarra. Under the influence of such a plausible scoundrel, a plastic youth with sporting proclivities like Harry Rogers was like clay in the hands of a potter. Rogers projected a visit to his Tasmanian home for the annual racing fortnight, and desiring to see his colours sported on the banks of the Derwent, he leased a horse named Tichborne from a Caulfield trainer with a view of winning a valuable bracelet at the Hobart meeting. Here began the trouble of his life. A well-connected East-led young fellow like Harry Rogers, able to mix with the best in society, with a racehorse at his disposal, was just the combination that Ogle was hungering for, and it was not difficult for him to worm himself in as an advisor-in-chief and manager of the racing outfit. He went to Tasmania with Rogers, who introduced him around, and he was asked to the best houses, as was another good-looking Englishman, a bookmaker. No actor, on or off the stage, could look or play the part of a gentleman better than Ogle. Most people regarded him as a real, genuine, dyed-in-the-wool article. The only man I heard doubt his bona fides was a quiet, observant and clever jockey, Alec Robinson, known as the Old Judge. The night before the race, there was some betting on the bracelet, which Rogers was so anxious to win with Tichborne, but the bookmakers refused to do business against his horse, except at odds-on. Le Merce had primed up Rogers upon the possibility of bringing off a big betting coup. Both were excessively annoyed when they discovered the betting ring knew as much as themselves. Ogle persuaded Rogers to leave the matter to him. He undertook to hoodwink the books and to pull off some big bets. He did, but not the way Rogers expected. Ogle, with the permission of Rogers, took charge of Tichborne on the morning of the race. Tichborne's attendant was engaged to ride early in the afternoon. Ogle sent him off to the course and undertook to bring the horse to the track himself. He did so, but before starting for Elwick, he adjourned to a cottage nearby, where he arranged matters and filled the horse up with bran mash and water. The jockey, Blair, was not in the secret, but a few big bookmakers were, among them the other Englishman already alluded to, who has been before the public as principal in some noted affairs during the past 10 years. Tichborne was knocked back to 5-1 in a field of 5 in the betting and finished 4th. The next day he ran in the flying handicap and the money came in for him in hatfuls. He started at even money, won in a common trot, beating the winner of the bracelet, and later on won the all-age stakes as he liked. Ogle and his friends got the money. Rogers didn't win enough to pay expenses. The reversal of form excited the curiosity of the stewards and they had Rogers in. In brief explanation was accepted, but he was gravely admonished. That night the stewards posted their finding in the public room at the Old Ship Inn. The papers had a good deal to say, and at last it leaked out that Ogle, alias Le Merce, had put in some fine work at the aforementioned Newtown cottage. The club caused Rogers and Ogle to be arrested on a charge of swindling. The charge was an attempt to defraud Mrs. A.P. Miller of the bracelet. Mrs. Miller was the wife of one of the club's leading officials, a really good sportsman, well known on both sides of the Straits. They were tried at the Glenorchy court. The charge against Rogers quickly fell to pieces, and Le Merce subsequently got off. He was quite at home in the court. He fairly bamboozled the bucolic magistrate. Rogers was a picture of shame and misery. The disgrace was too heavy to bear. He and Ogle were warned off for life. Subsequently, the embargo was removed from the boy, but it was never lifted from Ogle, whose antecedents were in the hands of the Melbourne police. There was an account on the 9th of September 1922 recalling this incident in Hobart. It says, as I believe he has no living relatives, there can be no harm in mentioning the bookmaker, a character named Peter Carey. He cut a great dash for a while, but not being at all particular in his dealings, soon came to grief.
He was reputed to be a member of a notorious confederacy known as the Long Firm, of which Frederick Lemers was another partner. Lemers, with his swell get-up and long drooping moustache, was a familiar figure in sporting resorts in the 80s until he was warned off in connection with the stuffing of Tichborne in Tasmania. The operations of the Long Firm terminated in Melbourne with, I think, a clever swindle they worked over the Nordenfeldts or Trident's Derby. The modus operandi was simplicity itself. One of the Confederates, who was in good credit with the ring, backed the favourite for all the money he could get, while at the same time the bookmaker partner laid every shilling he possibly could against it. If the favourite won, the bookmaker had to take the knock. If the favourite lost, the backer had to disappear. A big win was assured either way. As it happened, the favourite proved successful, and it was Pat Carey who had to take the knock. The backer managed to collect all his winning bets before the details of the swindle became public. Men like Lemers, Carey, and one or two other adventurers who flourished in that decade would not find it so easy to make money in the present day. So on the 24th of March 1887, Frederick was charged with neglecting to obey an order of the Supreme Court and was given a £112 fine or 3 hours imprisonment. In the Ballarat Star on the 27th of April 1887, he featured in an article titled "Alleged Fraud on the Railway Department at Seymour." At the local police court this morning, a young man named Frederick Ogle, alias Lemers, was proceeded against for having defrauded the railway commissioners. On the morning of the 25th of March, the defendant purchased a first-class ticket at Broadmeadows. It was suspected that there was an intention on the part of Ogle to defraud the department by using the ticket to travel to Benalla, where a race meeting was being held. The booking clerk, from whom the ticket was obtained, directed the attention of the guard of the train to the defendant with a request that he should be watched in case he travelled beyond the station for which he'd purchased the ticket. It was found that he did not alight at Broadmeadows, but proceeded on until he was challenged to produce his ticket. This occurred at Seymour. At Tallarook, the guard ordered the carriage door to be locked, and when arriving at Seymour, the guard and porter went to Lemers's carriage and asked for his ticket. The defendant said he lost it, and a friend of his named Campbell, who had got out, returned at the moment and said he'd left something in the carriage with Lemers, but he was detected trying to pass his own ticket to the former. Lemers said that he was willing to pay the extra expense and did not want to see his friend get into trouble. He also said he was playing nap and the ticket had been used as a double header. The defendant was said by Mr. Leonard to have left the old country for the country's good. The defendant said his name was Ogle and he was well known. He was never convicted before and owed no money. He left England on account of a row with his brother, and he took his wife's name and had spent money freely here and at home. He was going shooting, but got into the carriage with the others, who induced him to go to Benalla. Mr. White, PM, said the intent to defraud was clear, and the bench unanimously, without hesitation, fined the defendant £5, with £4 2s costs, to be paid in a week. Frederick didn't honour this. On the 30th of April 1887, he was in the Supreme Court under the name of Frederick Ogle, but listed as otherwise known as Frederick Lemers in a sheriff's debtor case. On the 15th of May 1887, a warrant was lodged, and it says new insolvent Frederick Ogle, otherwise Frederick Lemers, of Carlisle Street, St Kilda, commission agent. Causes of insolvency: having been imprisoned at the suit of a judgment creditor and insufficiency of income. Liabilities: £1,526, 3 shillings and 4 pence. Assets: 10 shillings. Deficiency: £1,525, 13 shillings and 4 pence. And in the Melbourne Argus on the 16th of July 1887. The case of Frederick Ogle, otherwise known as Lemers, which was recently adjudicated upon by the Supreme Court, will unfortunately perhaps possess some interest for many persons outside the profession of the law. The applicant has been arrested under an order directing that in default of the payment by him within a certain time of a sum of £112, 6 shillings and 4 pence for debt and costs, he should be imprisoned for 3 months. The order was made under the provisions of the imprisonment for debt statute, upon the grounds that the debtor had wilfully contracted the debt at a time when he had no reasonable expectation of being able to pay the same. Subsequent to his arrest, he filed his schedule in the Court of Insolvency, and his estate was voluntarily sequestrated for the benefit of his creditors. The application was nevertheless refused by a majority of the Supreme Court. So basically, Frederick Ogle got out of a prison sentence due to a loophole in the law. It doesn't pop up until 3 years later, and it says Robert Murphy, one of the defendants in the Premier Building Society prosecution, sued a bookmaker named Frederick Lemers at the St Kilda court yesterday for the return of a wager of £5. It had been laid on the result of a foot race at North Brighton, which was declared by the judge to be no race. Mr Marshall Lyle appeared for Murphy, but after some evidence had been taken, the case was adjourned. On the 5th of July 1892, it says Victorians especially will recollect the notorious Lemers, otherwise Ogle, who's been a figure on colonial racecourses for many years. He has been engaged in all kinds of cronk practices since he was warned off in Tasmania some years ago, but his latest escapade was working the confidence trick at the Sydney Driving Park trotting meeting on Friday. He, in company with another individual, represented himself as the owner of Childer Harold and succeeded in victimising a well-known sportsman who ought to have known better to the extent of £4. Lemers and his partner were promptly run in and were remanded in Saturday to the police court. Nearly a year later in Victoria, Frederick Ogle was arrested at the Epsom races yesterday afternoon on a charge of conspiring to defraud Sophia Osborne and other Sydney tradespeople of large sums of money on the 1st of January of last year and during March of this year. It is said that Ogle is one of a gang, some of the remainder of whom were recently arrested in Sydney. Another article saying the alleged extensive swindling, Frederick Ogle arrested. In connection with the charge of conspiracy against a number of persons who it is alleged has been carrying on a course of systematic swindling, another arrest was effected, bringing the total to 11. Frederick Ogle's been arrested in Melbourne on information laid by Sydney Police. He will be brought to Sydney and charged in conjunction with the others, the evidence against whom is at present being heard by Mr G. O'Malley Clark of the Water Police Court. And on the 6th of June 1893, the case against Sydney Stewart, Patrick Carey, George Gresham, Frederick Ogle, George Parker, Theodore Crampton, Claude Titans, James Stewart, Frederick Knight and May Crouch, charged with conspiracy to defraud, was continued before Judge Docker at the Sessions. On the 10th of June 1893, several members of the long firm of swindlers are well known in Victoria. One of them, J.M. Stewart, otherwise known as Slippers, did 12 months in Ballarat jail for welshing the district. Pat Carey was a well-known bookmaker of unsettled reputation, and he was a member of the Victorian and Tattersalls Club, but he made a mess of it in the finish and defaulted largely. When getting his sentence with Stewart as the ringleader of the long firm, he wept piteously and begged hard for mercy, but they were each awarded 5 years jail. Fred Ogle, otherwise known as Lemers, was a conspicuous figure on the Victorian turf for years. He would be remembered best in Ballarat as a big bettor on the pigeons. Fred is a tall, thin man of summery complexion, with a 16-hand moustache and tightly fitting pants. His legs being long and somewhat spindly, his get-up used to attract considerable attention. Fred got off with 2 years, but as he's said to be mixed up in the savings bank frauds, he may have to stand up again. And on the 13th of June 1893, another article, Patrick Carey and a tall, aristocratic-looking individual, known here as Lemers or Ogle, have bumped up against 2 rather severe legal rocks. Both of the prisoners better known in Victoria than in this colony. After a protracted trial, in conjunction with several others, they've been convicted of conspiracy on a long, firm principle. Carey has bid adieu to the racecourses and other schools of swindling for 5 years. Ogle will be found useful occupation in one of our jails for a period of 2 years. The various swindles of the gang amounted to around £3,000. And a little more detail on the conspiracy case. In response to the usual statement as to whether the accused wished to say anything, Frederick Ogle said the verdict of the jury surprised him very much. He understood that he could have gone into the box to give evidence on oath, but the opportunity was never offered him. His Honour said, "That's a mistake. You were all asked if you wished to give evidence." Ogle said the case had been well worked out and that he held that there was no justice in that court. The prisoner at this stage broke down and called for a glass of water, after which he proceeded again. Continuing, he said 3 of his relatives occupied the position His Honour occupied on the bench now, and they were judges in Dublin. He was left a considerable amount of property under his father's will in the shape of a business, which he had to relinquish. He afterwards came to Australia, landing in Melbourne in 1875, and it was an unlucky day for him. He met several good chaps in Melbourne, racing chaps, and became acquainted with Hales, the leading jockey. He speculated on the turf and on several occasions won large sums, and this put all commercial business out of his head. He went on at this, but subsequently lost more than he had on Archer's Derby. He won again but was not paid. He had 2 daughters, aged 17 and 19, who he educated at Tintern College in Hawthorn. His wife and children today were totally unprovided for. His Honour, in sentencing the prisoners, said he could find no fault with the verdict. The jury was one which the prisoners practically chose themselves, and they gave close attention to the case throughout, and that they were not unduly inclined to convict was shown by the fact that the others were acquitted. They were all men of good natural abilities, and if they only directed their talents in the proper channels, they would have succeeded well in life. The system of gambling, which had been carried on by some of them, had brought about their ruin. So on the 7th of June 1893, he received 2 years hard labour. On the 5th of July 1893, he also received 4 years hard labour concurrent with the 2-year sentence, and he was released on the 19th of September 1896 from Darlinghurst. On the 11th of June 1902, he was charged with contempt of court and received 24 hours imprisonment in Melbourne jail. 5 years later, in January 1907, alleged false pretences. Frederick Ogle, a tall man of rather military aspect, wearing extensively developed moustaches, was presented before the City Court today on the charge of obtaining a trunk valued at £70 by means of false pretences from Thomas C. Jackson of Collins Street. Sub-Inspector Biggs, in applying for a remand, said that it was alleged that the trunk was obtained between the 19th and 31st of December on the representation that it was intended for squatters with whom the accused had business in the Western District. He was remanded to appear on Wednesday. Bail was fixed at 2 sureties in £50 or 1 in £100. 3 days later, he was committed to trial. The salesman deposed that Ogle said that he was a squatter and lived at Toorak, and he had no hesitation in sending the goods. The police declared that Ogle has been a resident of Melbourne for 20 years and is a swindler. And further details of that case is a sensation was caused in the Court of General Sessions on Tuesday when a prisoner was about to be sentenced on a charge of false pretences. The accused was a man named Frederick Ogle, 61 years of age, well known about Paran as an alleged well-to-do resident of Williams Road, where up to the time of his arrest a couple of months ago, he lived in a pretentious 2-storied house with his family. On December the 22nd, he obtained from Thomas Charles Jackson, a portmanteau and truck manufacturer of Collins Street, goods to the value of £70, representing himself as a prominent grazier. He was found guilty, and before passing sentence, Judge Johnson said that on being searched that morning, before being put into the dock, a loaded revolver was found in possession of the accused. On being asked why he was carrying the weapon, Ogle made no reply. Detective McNamee said the accused had victimised many people and was in the habit of walking the streets with Welshers and suspected persons. The judge referred to the man as a most dangerous class of criminal and sentenced him to 5 years with hard labour. This was the maximum penalty for swindling. He was released from Pentridge on the 23rd of December 1910, and he died on the 5th of April 1912 at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne at the age of 64. And an article outlining his death says a man named Frederick Ogle was alighting from a tram in Church Street, Windsor on Thursday night and was knocked down by a motor car. He suffered severely from his injuries. He was taken to Alfred Hospital and died there early yesterday morning. 5 years later, we see his wife featured in a Licensing Act transfer. So on the 16th of March 1917, I, Richard Septimus Lauder, holder of the licensee of the Bayswater Hotel in Bayswater, Western Australia, transfer the publican's licence held by me to Adelaide Louisa Ogle. 2 years later, she's still the publican of the Bayswater Hotel. And then Adelaide passes away on the 16th of June 1921 at Bayswater. It says she's the beloved mother of Mrs. Barker of Maylands and Mrs. Smith and Miss Ogle of Bayswater and Mrs. F. and A.G. Ogle of Victoria, and she was 70 years old. There was an article in the paper on her death, and it says a sweet-souled, womanly personality faded gently out of existence last week at Bayswater, where died Mrs. Adelaide Louise Ogle, mother of one of Western Australia's best-liked public women, Miss Frances Ogle. Mrs. Ogle, who was also the mother of the equally well-known Mrs. Matt Barker, late of Pinjarra, Mrs. Smith of Bayswater, and Mrs. F. and A.G. Ogle of Victoria, was one of the most lovable and likeable women in the state, and of her sweet unselfishness in all the ways and walks of life, endeared herself to all who knew her. Always modest and retiring, she won golden opinions and at her own special request was interred quite privately, her 2 sons coming over express from Victoria in time to receive her last words. So Frederick and Adelaide's children. The firstborn was Adelaide Ethel Ogle. She was born Adelaide Lemurse due to her parents being unmarried on the 27th of July 1874 in Antrim, Ireland. Adelaide married Alexander Noel Smith. In 1915, Adelaide was working as a nurse and living in Pinjarra, Western Australia. In 1916, she was living and working at Meekatharra, Western Australia, and in 1931, living and working at Mount Helena, Western Australia, all without Alexander listed. They had a daughter, Adelaide Doris Smith, in Brunswick, Victoria, in 1894. Adelaide Senior died on the 4th of August 1942 at Mount Helena, Western Australia, aged 68, and she was listed as a widow. Their daughter Adelaide seemed to move with her mother to Western Australia in 1916, but then she lived with her Aunt Frances at Maylands Hotel at Maylands near Fremantle in Western Australia. Adelaide married Norman Crowther, a wool buyer, on the 4th of October 1920 in Guildford, Western Australia. And the marriage notice says Crowther Smith on October the 4th at St Matthew's Church in Guildford. Norman, only son of Tom Wilby Crowther of Westcliff, Essex, and Coleman Street, London, to Doris Adelaide Smith, only child of Alexander Smith of Melbourne and Mrs Smith of Bayswater. So that indicates that in 1920, Alexander was still alive. In 1923, her aunt, Frances Senior, Norman, Adelaide, and their infant daughter, Eleanor Frances, sailed from London to Fremantle. Under the name Doris, she did another trip to England in 1960. Norman Crowther died in 1961 and Doris moved to St Kilda, Victoria. She died in St Kilda on the 7th of March 1980 at the age of 86. Her daughter, Eleanor, married Douglas Yule Thompson in Perth in 1943. It says Eleanor, and in brackets Joy, daughter of Mrs D.A. Crowther of Claremont, to Pilot Officer Douglas Y. Thompson of the RAAF, eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. S.C.L. Thompson of North Balwyn, Victoria. So Doris's daughter, Eleanor, lived in Western Australia. However, Eleanor and Douglas divorced in 1966. Frederick and Adelaide's second child was Maud Victoria Summers Ogle, who was born in Coleraine, Ireland in 1876. She married Matthew Charles Barber in 1898 in Victoria. They had a son, Charles Victor Barber, 2 years before their marriage. He enlisted in World War I and died on the 8th of August 1915 in Turkey, aged only 21. He bequeathed all to his sister in his will as he went into service. His sister, Sarah Linda Ogle Barber, was born in 1900 in Victoria. Sarah did not marry and died on the 15th of September 1985 at Subiaco, Western Australia, aged 85. Maud and Matthew Barber moved to Western Australia by 1910, where Matthew ran a hotel at Pinjarra in Western Australia, and Matthew died in 1930, and Maud and Sarah lived at Maylands, Western Australia, and Maud died on the 11th of January 1946 at the age of 70. Their third child, Frances Annie Louisa Ogle, was born on the 19th of April 1878 in Belfast, Ireland. By 1903, she'd moved to Perth, Western Australia, and was working as a barmaid. By 1916, she was living at Maylands and managing a hotel. Adelaide Senior and Doris were living with her at this time. Frances did not marry and she died on the 19th of February 1928 in Perth, aged only 49. Their fourth child, Frederick William Henry Ogle, was born on the 29th of November 1883 in St Kilda, Victoria. In 1903, he was living at South Yarra, and by 1907, he was living in Fremantle, Western Australia, and working as a commercial traveller. By 1909, he was living with his mother at Paran in Victoria. He married Constance Elmer Davies in Victoria in 1919 when he was 27 and Constance 24, and they had 9 children. In the Melbourne Standard on the 4th of December 1930, there's an article titled Claim for Seized Goods. At the Melbourne Court on Monday, Constance Ogle claimed for return of goods seized by the police on behalf of Oliver Murphy. Constable Hubbard gave evidence that the goods included a ton of wood that had been seized in default of payment of judgment for £7, Oliver Murphy against Mr. F. Ogle. Since the seizure, Mrs. Ogle has claimed the goods as her property. Mrs. Ogle gave evidence that she bought the goods, receipts being produced by Mr. Negan, the wood she had bought from some men canvassing the district. After considerable cross-examination, it was put to the bench that Mrs. Ogle was out to get credit through her husband and then default. The bench asked Murphy why all the wood had not been used, and he replied that it was a mystery. In fact, the whole house was a mystery to people in the locality. The bench ordered the return of the seized goods, with the exception of the stack of wood, some wire netting and galvanised iron, and granted Mrs. Ogle £2 2 costs. By 1931, it seems they separated, Frederick living without Constance in Paran, and Frederick died on the 9th of January 1956 in Malvern, Victoria, aged 72. Their fifth child was Arthur Gordon Ogle, who was born on the 3rd of June 1889 in St Kilda, Victoria. He was a railway employee, and he married Nora Philomena Madigan, also known as Honora Teresa, in Victoria in 1915. They had 2 children. In 1917, they were living at Ararat in Victoria, and then they lived in Brunswick in 1942. And Arthur died on the 26th of September 1967 in Brunswick, aged 78. Their son, Frederick George Ogle, was born in 1917 and in 1942 was a librarian. He enlisted in World War II at Adelaide River, Northern Territory, and served in Papua New Guinea, and he was discharged on the 25th of January 1946. He married Joan Wallace Sherlock, who was in the Australian Women's Service in World War II, and they married in 1947 in Victoria. In November 1950, they had quads. So the article about the birth of the quadruplets says 2 boys and 2 girls were born to Mr. and Mrs. Gordon Ogle of West Brunswick on Saturday afternoon. Tonight, the mother and all 4 children were reported to be doing splendidly at the Moreland Sacred Heart Hospital. The father, 33-year-old Gordon Ogle, an ex-serviceman, is a senior clerk at the Brunswick Rope and Cordage Factory. With 3-year-old daughter Denise, the family have been living in a converted garage in 2nd Avenue, West Brunswick. The births had been anticipated for 6 weeks. The family doctor and 3 leading Melbourne specialists had preparations complete for the birth of the quads. All 4 children were born within 47 minutes with a normal delivery. The first, a boy, was born at 4:48 p.m. on Saturday, and the last, a girl, at 5:35 p.m. The children will not be weighed for a few days, but the hospital staff estimate that the weight of the 2 boys is 5 pounds each and the girls 3 pounds each. And an article where they interview Joan. Our quads are well, and mother is too. Quadruplets who were born to Mrs. Joan Ogle, 28, of Brunswick, in the Sacred Heart Hospital at Moreland on Saturday afternoon. The attractive young mother and all 4 babies are doing well. Mr. and Mrs. Ogle, both born in Victoria, were married in March 1947, soon after they'd been discharged from the services. Mr. Ogle served in New Guinea as a staff sergeant in the AIF, and Mrs. Ogle was a corporal in the AWAS. Their father is a tall, slim, bespectacled man who's 33 and a cost accountant at the cordage works at Downs & Son in Castles Road, Brunswick. Mr. Ogle has 1 sister. He was educated at St Kevin's College, Hayington, where he was a keen student, and he was also a first-class athlete and tennis player. Mrs. Ogle is a tall, hazel-eyed brunette. She has 1 sister and 2 brothers. She met her husband at a dance when they were both in uniform. Mr. Ogle has been living with his family in a converted garage at the rear of his parents' home in 2nd Avenue, Brunswick, for several years. The house is only 200 yards from the Sacred Heart Hospital. On Saturday, Mr. Ogle told friends he had no immediate plans for the future, and he said he would take the quads back to their present living quarters. State Cabinet has promised to find a new home for the family very soon. Financial aid for the quads' upbringing is also being planned. Mr. Ogle's only sister, Mrs. Reen Caffin, who lives at the same address, gave birth to 2 girls in the Sacred Heart Hospital 7 months ago. Apart from these, there have been no multiple births on either side of the family as far back as can be traced. The young couple were told by their family doctor a fortnight ago that they could expect quads. This had been revealed by a long series of daily x-rays. Mr. Ogle spent Saturday night chain smoking and ringing close friends. He said he had startling news to tell them and then announced the arrival of quads. Friends said he sounded so excited that he could hardly talk. Birth of the quads was supervised by 2 leading Collins Street obstetricians, assisted by Dr. Spring, a children's specialist, and an anaesthetist. The boys were born first. When I can see them, were Mrs. Ogle's first words later, it's going to be a bit tough to manage 4 at once, but we'll get along. I never thought anything like this would happen to me. Immediately after birth, the babies were placed in specially heated cots, known as humidicribs, where they will remain until tomorrow at least. Their clothing will not be taken off at any time while they are in the cots. Only a few special nurses will be allowed into their carefully guarded nursery. 2 days later, another report says that 3 of the Ogle quads born in Melbourne on Saturday night are reported to be very ill this morning, and their condition is causing anxiety. The matron of the Sacred Heart Hospital where the quads were born said this morning that 3 of the babies were very anemic and had been receiving blood transfusions since last night. Although there is no immediate danger, the hospital staff were very worried about the quad's condition. The sick babies have not been moved from their cribs, but the remaining quad, Gerard Raymond, was taken out and weighed yesterday. The mother has been told that 3 of her babies are very sick. Meanwhile, daily prayers are being held in the hospital chapel for the safety of the quads. And another 2 days later, Gerard Raymond Ogle, one of the West Brunswick quadruplets, died at 1 p.m. today, but a sister at the Sacred Heart Hospital in Moreland said tonight that the other 3 appeared to have a reasonable chance of living. The mother, Mrs. Joan Ogle, saw her baby for the first time before he died. "I still have 3 more babies. Most mothers don't get 2 chances," she said tonight. When it is known that the boy was failing, nurses took him to his mother. Of the other 3, a hospital sister said that at 9 p.m. they were lively and crying out for their food with the best of them. The quadruplets were all Rh factor babies. This was known by the doctors before the births. Tests showed that Mrs. Ogle was Rh negative. As soon as the babies arrived, the doctors obtained blood tests and confirmed their fears that the quadruplets were Rh babies. It was this blood condition which caused the death of Gerard. All the difficulties of the multiple birth and prematurity have been overcome. All the quadruplets possibly would have lived, but for the misfortune that the Rh factor was present. The 2 girls have not yet been weighed, but the other boy, Anthony Gordon, today tipped the scales at 4 pounds and 4.5 ounces. The 4 babies were christened in the hospital today. And the 3 other children did survive. By 1954, Gordon was working as a clerk, and they moved to Western Australia by 1972, where he was a store manager. Frederick Ogle's brothers who came out to Australia. Frederick Ogle's twin, Isaac Walker Challoner Ogle, appears to have been a charmer. He reputedly received a good education and qualifications in law and went on to work as a clerk, and in one case a partner for several law firms, and embezzled from every one of them. There are many newspaper and court articles of his offences, including one of molesting a girl. When their father drew up his will 3 months before his death in September 1869, Isaac was not mentioned, and this was about the same time as his marriage. He married Sarah Ann Blake on the 5th of June 1869 at St Jude in Camden, England, when he was 21 and Sarah 20. They had 4 children: Francis Herbert Blake Ogle, who was born on the 25th of August 1870 at Rathmines in Dublin, Ireland, who died on the 18th of May 1871 in Dublin, aged only 9 months, and he was known to the family as Bertie. Frederick Arthur de Elberg Ogle was born on the 27th of May 1872, and I found no other information available on him, so it's quite possible that he died as an infant as well. Evelyn Ethel Maud Ogle was born on the 28th of June 1873, more on her later, and the 4th child was George Alfred W. Ogle, born 1877 in Dublin, but died in September 1881. So as far as I can discover, Evelyn, the daughter, was the only child of Isaac Ogle, who survived infancy. In Dublin, Isaac was working as a solicitor, acting in public auctions of property. Isaac married Margaret Brady in 1877 and had a child with her, Leonard James Ogle, on the 23rd of May 1878 in London. The child was baptised in Dublin but died at less than 2 months old, and it's quite likely that he committed bigamy. Sarah lived with her aunt in Brixton, Surrey, England in 1901, and she died in 1904 in her mother's home in Strood, Kent. And the inscription on her grave says, "In loving memory of Sarah Ann Ogle, daughter of Arthur and Harriet Blake, who died on the 24th of November 1904, aged 56. On the 27th of May 1878, so only 4 days after his 5th child was born with Margaret Brady, he was tried at the Old Bailey in London with forgery. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. Says that Isaac joined a Dublin firm of solicitors, embezzled various sums and absconded. He was next heard of in London, where he endeavoured to obtain a large sum of money by means of a forged telegram signed Lord Maslarini. The forgery was discovered, the prisoner tried and sentenced in spite of his appeal for mercy on the grounds of his wife's extravagance as the cause of his wrongdoing. So he absconded to Australia in 1879 and by September 1881 was living in Melbourne. There is a birth of a Ferdinand Ogle, son of Isaac Ogle and Margaret Howard, who was born in Hotham East in 1880 and survived only 11 days. So this is quite possibly another child of Isaac's. Another article says that one of our cablegrams yesterday reported the arrest at Manchester of a Melbourne defaulter named Isaac Ogle, a law clerk, formerly employed by Mr. Duffett, a solicitor of Melbourne. In April last, some clothes belonging to Ogle were found on St Kilda Beach, and it was presumed that he drowned whilst bathing or had committed suicide. On examination of accounts, it showed a deficiency of £2,000, and then it was suspected that the clothes had been placed on the beach only as a ruse. Inquiries showed that Ogle misappropriated one cheque for £500 and another similar one given to pay fees in connection with the preparation of the Melbourne Tramway Omnibus Company's bill. On a warrant being issued, Ogle went under an assumed name to Adelaide, thence home by the Sarati, with the intention of leaving at Suez and going to Mexico. But he changed his mind and went on to England, where he was arrested at Manchester by the police. And in the Australian Government Gazette, it says Isaac Challoner Ogle is charged on warrant with larceny as a servant of the sum of £6 10 shillings and other monies, the property of his late employer, Joseph Gibb Duffett of Melbourne, on the 28th of April. His description: Irish, broad accent, solicitor's clerk, 32 years of age, 5 foot 7 inches high, medium build and a red beard worn all round, dresses well. On the 2nd of May 1882, it was reported that Isaac C. Ogle was brought out from England in custody under the Fugitives Offenders Act and arrived in the colony by the Garonne a fortnight ago, which is interesting because Frederick and his wife also came out on the Garonne in the same year, and has been committed for trial for absconding to England with several sums of money belonging to Mr. Duffett, solicitor, with whom the prisoner was engaged in the capacity of a head clerk. When Ogle was arrested in England, £900 in cash was found in his possession. Interestingly, when he was arrested on board the ship absconding from Australia, he was in the company of a lady named Miss Brady, who he said was the sister of his wife. Remember that Margaret Brady was who he had a child with back in 1877. On the 2nd of December 1882, in Melbourne, he was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour, served in Melbourne jail. And whilst there, he was awarded a position of clerk, and he started altering the length of the prison sentence of other prisoners. In the Bendigo Advertiser, it says Isaac Ogle, formerly Mr. Duffett's law clerk, and a young man who was generally liked, pleaded guilty at the General Sessions before Judge Cope this morning to the larceny of 3 small sums of money from his employer. He did not have much to say except that he'd already been 6 months in jail and was a ruined man. And a little more detail on the case in the Melbourne General Sessions. Isaac Ogle, formerly managing clerk to Mr. Duffett's solicitor, was placed in the box for having stolen 3 sums of money, £33, £28 and 11 shillings and £6 and 10 shillings, entrusted to him by his employer to pay away to other persons last April. The prisoner who absconded and went to England after he committed the larcenies was apprehended there and brought back, pled guilty and called Mr. Duffett as a witness to previous good character. Mr. Duffett stated that the prisoner performed his duties well while he was employed by him. The prisoner in mitigation of sentence pointed out that he'd already been in custody for 6 months and that he was also punished to a great extent by having lost his social position. The chairman said that a person in a responsible position such as the prisoner had occupied must have what was considered to be of good character, or he would not be employed in the position, and that when such a person committed a fraud, he necessarily lost his good character and status. Says it's highly been ascertained that Ogle highly distinguished himself at Dublin University, where he won a gold medal for the best examination. He joined a Dublin firm of solicitors, embezzled various sums and absconded. He was next heard of in London, where he endeavoured to obtain a large sum of money by means of a forged telegram. The forgery was discovered, the prisoner tried and sentenced. On the expiration of the sentence, the prisoner went to Melbourne and had been there 3 years when he committed embezzlement that led to this arrest. So on his Victorian jail record, it says that he was married, his wife was in England, and he had no relatives in the colony except 2 children at school, and then he had come out from London to Melbourne in 1879. So interesting that he said that he had no relatives in the colony, and obviously he didn't have contact with Frederick. Another article says a somewhat peculiar instance of the ruling passion has just been discovered at the Melbourne jail. It will be remembered that some time ago a law clerk named Isaac Ogle absconded from the colony after having falsified the books of his employer, Mr. Duffett, solicitor of Collins Street West, and misappropriated nearly £2,000. He was traced to Brighton, England, where he was arrested and brought back to Victoria on an extradition warrant, and on being tried received a sentence of 2 years' imprisonment in Melbourne jail. Shortly after his admission, Ogle, because of his ability as an accountant, was promoted to the position of clerk, and it now appears that as soon as ever he became acquainted with his duties, he at once proceeded to falsify the books and disorganise the discipline of the institution by altering the terms of imprisonment of several prisoners. In one case, which has been discovered, Ogle appears to have falsified the figures in no less than 12 of the books kept in the office, by which a prisoner named Coates had his sentence reduced by 10 days. The falsification was carried out in a most systematic manner, and for article penmanship it reflected most creditably upon the offender. On the cases being discovered, Ogle was brought before Mr. Paynton, the visiting justice, who sentenced him to 3 days' imprisonment and deprived him of the usual remission made to prisoners of good behaviour. Since the offence, Ogle has been returned to the prison ward, where he will have to work out the remainder of his sentence. Isaac was freed on the 30th of June 1884. There is a record of an Isaac W. Ogle convicted in Dublin in 1889, who received 12 months for fraud, and in 1892, 12 months jail for forgery, and in 1894, 6 months for stealing a coat. There is also an Isaac Walter Ogle who was convicted of forgery with intent to defraud and given 9 months' imprisonment in Liverpool in April 1899. In the 1901 census in Liverpool, there is an Isaac C. Ogle listed as a lodging house manager, and the census entry puts his age at 46 and his birthplace London. I'm unable to find a definitive death notice for Isaac. It seems that Isaac and Sarah's surviving daughter, Ethel Evelyn Maud Ogle, who was born on the 5th of July 1873 in Dublin, Ireland, came out to Australia. She is listed as departing England for Victoria on the 5th of August 1898 as a 25-year-old nurse. In 1912, she was living in Armidale, Victoria, and working as a cleaner. In 1914, she was living in Port Melbourne, and she died on the 8th of May 1921 in North Melbourne, aged only 47, and she did not marry. Frederick's other brother that came out to Australia was Francis Robert Ogle, who was born in Ireland in 1849. He married Lillian Craig on the 7th of March 1876 in Liverpool, Lancashire, England, and after he came to Melbourne, he was admitted to Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum on the 26th of January 1880, and it was listed on his record that he had intemperate habits, so in other words, an alcoholic. On the 12th of July 1880, he was moved to the hospital. He was paralysed and continued in this state until the November, where he completely became confined to his bed, and by February of 1881, his record states that he was utterly helpless. His cause of death was softening of the brain and gangrenous lungs, and he died on the 6th of July 1881 at the age of only 31. And his death record says, Francis Robert Ogle, July the 6th in Melbourne, third son of the late Frederick Ogle, wine merchant, Belfast. So the interesting story of Frederick Ogle. I hope you enjoyed all the twists and turns and the mysteries that I've uncovered throughout this episode.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.